Hi, my name is Stacy Cartledge, and today my oral presentation will be on Washington Irving and the two literary pieces, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If you'll look at page 1 of your handout, you'll see a definition for imagery, which is the literary term that I chose to analyze while reading these two pieces. The definition, as you see, is a common term of variable meaning. Imagery includes the mental pictures that readers experience with a passage of literature. It signifies all of the sensory perceptions referred to in a poem, whether by literal description, allusion, simile, or metaphor. First, I will begin with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If you'll look at the very first picture on your handout, you'll see a picture of the small town of Sleepy Hollow. And just a brief excerpt from the story, which will give you kind of an example of imagery and how Washington Irving used it in his work. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there's a little valley among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook murmurs through it, and the occasional whistle of quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks the uniform tranquility. And that's from page 1 of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which you can find at East of the Web, my first works cited piece. As you can see, Washington Irving does an amazing job of using his words to create images in your head. While you're reading, you can't help but think of Sleepy Hollow as a quiet, kind of mysterious town, one that you would be curious even to visit yourself. The main character of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is Ichabod Crane, and he is described by Washington Irving as an exceedingly lank person with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangle a mile out of his sleeves, and feet that might have served for shovels. So he doesn't only describe him as, tall, lanky, thin, maybe a little homely. He goes so far as to say that to see him striding along on a windy day with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. So he uses imagery to help create that picture of what Ichabod Crane looks like. And he ends up becoming a person in this story that you would be curious to hang out with, to spend time with. He's just described as kind of a whimsical character, and the words that Washington Irving uses to describe him brings him to life. So he's more than just a character on the pages of a book. He's actually in your imagination brought to life. And he goes on to describe the schoolhouse where Ichabod works at, and you'll see that as the second picture on my handout. His schoolhouse was a low building of only one room. It was rudely constructed of logs, and it stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. So again, he uses imagery to describe this schoolhouse in a way that also brings the house to life. This is a room that you not only can imagine children just sitting there at desks, but this is kind of a creepy schoolhouse that kind of adds some depth and character to the whole story, which is a classic kind of a horror story, one that's been passed down over the years and that you're probably familiar with. So we're going to switch gears and check out the Rip Van Winkle story, which you can find in your textbook. If you'll turn to page 621, you'll find a autobiography of Washington Irving himself, and Rip Van Winkle is also in that section. The third picture on my handout, you'll see a picture of the Catskill Mountains, which Washington describes swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed, every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains. Does that sound like a normal way that just your average author would describe the mountains? No. Washington Irving is the master of imagery. He brings the mountains to life, and he further does so by describing how Rip Van Winkle traveled through the mountains, and he met up with a group of men where he presumably indulged in a little bit of alcohol, and then slept for 20 years. I think most of you are familiar with this story. But he describes the men that Rip Van Winkle encounters. He says one had a large head and a broad face and small piggish eyes. The other had the face that consisted entirely of nose and was surmounted by a white sugarloaf hat. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. So even though these men play a somewhat small role in this story, he describes them so precisely so that you can actually feel like you're a bystander in this story. You can see it unfolding in your imagination. And Washington Irving does such a great job with imagery that both of these pieces were enjoyable to read. They set my imagination on fire, and I would certainly recommend that anyone who's taking this course or otherwise definitely check out these two pieces if you haven't before. In conclusion, my oral presentation was on imagery and Washington Irving's pieces Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks.